POW camp was a hard experience for all the prisoners, but much worse and much more dangerous was the road as the camps were evacuated to the west to escape the oncoming Red Army. Most of these marches took place in the winter of 1944-45 through the snow and cold, but one of the worst incidents happened in the fall as the most easternmost camps were evacuated, and at Heiderkrug, a group of POWs ran into a group of German forces, defeated, angry, and looking for someone to take it out on.
Our first prison camp was up in Stalag Luft 6 up on the Baltic, Estonia. Well, in July, here come the Russians. So they put us on a train, took us down to this port. They put us down in the hold of this ship, and they'd been hauling coal in it. And this is the middle of July. And there must have been 1,000 of us down this hole. I remember going down this rope ladder, and these Germans were just ripping packs off the guys, and it was panic. We were in the hold of this ship for 3 days. No water to speak of. They tried to send some water down. Most of it got spilled by guys panicking. I know I didn't eat for 3 days. They took us off of there, and man, I thought, hell, it was all over with, but they put us on these train, and they shackled 2 of us together at the ankles, took our shoes away. They had a bunch of us one end of the boxcar and the guards on the other end. And they took us off of that train, gave us our shoes back, and then they handcuffed us together at the wrists. As my left wrist, and this guy I'm with, it was his right. And they brought in a contingent of young German Marines. Just young kids, you might say. And then they brought another contingent of soldiers in with police dogs. So then they ran us for 5 kilometers with bayonets and police dogs up to this new prison camp. And guys were, well, it was like they were just beating the shit out of guys. I can still see them. Dogs biting at their legs, biting at our legs. And I had a guy with me, and he says, Len, I don't think I can make it. Well, guys were falling, you know, and they were getting the shit beat out of them. And I says, yes, you can. And I reached up back, and I'm handcuffed in, and I reached up and got a hold of that shirt that he had made his pack, and I ripped that off. And about that time, it seemed like I got a second wind, and I just, do you ever get a second wind? God, I thought, God. So anyway, we made it on up there, and they run us into this Vorlager, like that's outside of the main camp. And God, I saw these guys coming, and they're just, some of them bleeding. Guys were patting each other on the back. They made it up there, and I can still see that. I'm sorry, I guess you don't forget these damn things.
I've rolled towards spring. The POW camp saw an increasing number of prisoners marching in from the east where they had been evacuated. They came in really bad shape. They were poorly nourished. They were sick. They had gone through real hell on the road. Looking at this, the American senior officer at Stalag Luft 1 at Barth on the Baltic Sea, Colonel Hub Zemke, decided this didn't look like a good idea. There were 9,000 prisoners in the camp. How would they be fed? How would they be housed? It looked dangerous. And when the German commandant called him in and told him, be ready to march in 24 hours' notice, Zemke called a meeting of his senior officers and the British, and they all agreed they were not going to march if they could possibly avoid it. Zemke asked for a meeting with the German commandant and told him, we're not going to go. The German thought it over, and the next day informed Zemke that there would be a march, but it would only include the guards. They were leaving, and the Americans were now in charge of the camp. Other prisoners, seeing the same situation, decided to take measures into their own hands and either escape on their own or hide in the camps and wait for the liberators to arrive.
So when they went to move our camp, we hid out. The rest of them decided it was too risky. because they would shoot you if you tried to escape. There wasn't much question in our mind about that. Number one, I suppose, being young as I was not as concerned of the risk. You know, kids will take a risk that when you're older and smarter you wouldn't take. So I was willing to take that risk rather than take the march in 0 weather or below, snow, probably 8 or 10 inches on the ground. And this is what when we escaped, that's what we were in. And so they were taking them west, and on that, they said they were taking them to Berlin. I have no idea where they were taking them. I could care less. But anyhow, I just decided that my chances were just as great trying to escape. Besides that, I wanted to get out of there. I wasn't a model prisoner. I wouldn't always snap to like I should have. And we took a section of the floor. What we've been doing, been going down there and robbing the underpinning of the barracks. Those barracks are about to fall down to use for wood in order to get some heat in there. So this other fellow and I, we got down there. They put the floor back down over us, and that's real sandy soil, much like it is up here. And we had piled snow up around the buildings to keep it as warm as we could, you know. And anyhow, we got down under there, and when they moved the camp out, and we had guards come through 2 or 3 times, you know, you could hear them overhead, up on the floor above us. But they eventually left, and that night we dug out and headed across we headed east, the general direction we thought it was, and we were close to the Oder River. And we walked across that river. It was solid ice. In fact, they were taking trucks across there. So we would hide out in the daytime and move at night. And when we finally got back to the Russian lines, what we did, we went into a barn when we could hear fighting just beyond us. We went into this barn, and there was a root cellar there. You know what a root cellar is? It's underground. What they store, their turnips, their beets and potatoes and that kind of thing. And we hid out in there until the Russians come into that building, and then he hollered out to them that we were Amerikansky. And I found that was a magic word as far as the Russian was concerned. And then we stayed with Russian soldiers. We would always find some Russian soldiers to spend the night with, because they weren't too careful who they shot or what they did. But after we got back to where we were with civilians, the Polish people were the finest people that you could ever know. They just were super. And of course, he could talk with them. He knew the language, or fairly well at least. And so they always found us a home to stay in. And they would come from several houses around or across town, maybe, I don't know how. But anyhow, they were so severely rationed on food, but they would bring and share what little they had with us. And I got back somewhere into central Russia, and I'm not sure where. I was just heading east. I really didn't know where I was going, except I was going to Moscow. That's what I was, that's the message I would give them. You found very few Russians that could speak English. Now in Poland, you found quite a few of the Polish people that could speak English. So this was nice. But I finally got back into somewhere central. I say central because Russia's quite a ways across, but somewhere between the border and Moscow, and met a Russian doctor who had studied in the Mayo Clinic here in the United States. He spoke perfect English. Apparently a high-ranking man. Took me under his wing and took me back to their quarters and fed me a good dinner at their officers' mess. And then he took me to the railroad station and gave me a letter, a pass. He said, Odessa is open now, and that's probably your best bet. So I got acquainted with these 3 fellows and told them my story. And one of them happened to be from close to Newberry, and that's where we were camped. So we had something in common there. They got me some British seaman's clothes, and the night before the ship left, he made it up with the guy on the watch and sneaked me aboard one of those ships. I turned myself in the next day to an officer that I saw after I come out of hiding, and he asked me how I got on board, and I said I just sneaked aboard, and he kind of laughed and said, "No, you didn't." But that was the end of it. Went down to Istanbul, Constantinople, but Istanbul today, and a couple of British intelligence officers interrogated me for a while. Sent me on down. That ship went on down to and stopped at Port Said, Egypt, and I was put aboard there. Put ashore there at Port Said, Egypt. I don't know if you know it or not, but we had one of our largest air bases there, and interesting. I wanted to get on home, but I also was hurting some. So they sent me to Naples to a hospital, and they did some more operating on my arm and shoulder, and sent me to Tunis, Oran, Casablanca, and home.
Some of them, I had a buddy that escaped, but I didn't want to take a chance on getting shot. And I think that's the chance that he took, because we knew that the war was within weeks of being over. I mean, our aircraft were flying all over the place, shooting up cars and trains.
We could have gotten away at any time. There weren't too many of them, you know. Maybe one guard for a couple of hundred guys. You could stepped off at night. You could stepped off the road and been free. Few guys did, but they had to go through the SS to get back to the American lines, because that was all that was holding the Americans back at all, was some SS fighters. So I was tempted now and then, but I figured, nope, we've come this far. There's safety in numbers. They're not going to wipe us out, you know, a huge column like this. They can't do it. And if they try to do it, then you can run. But at this point, better to just stick it out.
We were told not to escape. The colonel said you will be you could be court-martialed if you escape, because he said the Germans have SS men on the perimeters, and especially the Hungarian SS. If they pick you up, they just shoot you. He said, so you are under orders not to escape. I got down to a little town called Gamelsdorf, and I could hear the artillery. I could hear 105s or whatever they were, 155s, and I knew the Americans were coming. And I said, "Geez, I'm just going to stay here. I'm not going to." And we were told the next morning we were going to go into the permanent camp, and then the capper was that was the day that we were told by laughing Germans that Roosevelt is dead. Roosevelt is tot. Ha ha. You know, and I'd never lost a president before. But I said to myself, you know, I'm tired of this. I don't want to go back into another camp. The American Army is going to be here in the next couple of days. I'll just stay behind. And now you have to recognize that everybody in that area was dressed the same as I was. All these Arbeiten commandos, who are the workers, who were military enlisted men from the Poles and the Canadians and the British and the Americans. The enlisted men could go out and work in farms or work on work crews or do anything. And they were called Arbeiten Kommando, like not commando, but commando. And so I was dressed just like everybody else, and when I stayed behind, it wasn't a matter of hiding. I could just be there, and nobody would talk to me, and there were other guys running around. Just like I was, dressed just like I was. And then I decided that, and after 2 days, that the artillery stopped. And I said, "Oh shit! They swung somewhere else, and I'm going to run out of food here, and I'm going to have to give myself up, and I don't want to do that because they'll kill me." And so I said, "Well, I know where I am, and I know where I have to go." And so over the next 10 or 12 days, I walked about 120 kilometers down to Kempten and Dornbirn, and finally got down to the and there's a point of Switzerland that is joined by Germany and Austria, and it's very mountainous, and you travel valleys, but there are signposts that tell you where you are, and again there's so many refugees. There's thousands of Germans moving around trying to get out of the Russian zone. That there's just mass confusion. The only problem I had in traveling that is that I didn't have any papers, and I couldn't walk across a bridge. So what do you do when you can't walk across a bridge? You have to swim the river. So I was always wet, and there's nothing as wet as a GI overcoat. You can take your shirt off and dry your pants out, but that coat never dries. And I swam 4 rivers. Finally got down to the border, and I knew it was the border into Switzerland because I knew it was the Rhine River, and there was a barbed wire on the German side, substantial barbed wire, double system with tangle wire in the middle. Watched the German guards and their dogs walking, so I used the same, and they would walk it at 4 o'clock, and then they would walk it the next morning. And I said, I got to get out of here. And if I'm going to do it, I'm going to get out at night. So I got down to the wire. And of course, then I realized that I didn't exactly know where the Germans had walked. And I started to say, this could be bad, because Germans were known to mine their barbed wire fence systems, either internally as you touch the wire, or mostly in the ground, 3 feet down. So I started to dig, and I didn't have any tools, and I bloodied my hands and got through the first strands. The tangle wire was the worst, because you can't avoid it. You lift it, and just when you think you're out, it's caught your pants, and I ripped myself up quite a bit, and finally got through. And going through the last one, I was so afraid that I was going to die or be caught there and shot that my tongue stuck to the top of my mouth. And that's an awful feeling. I had no moisture in my body. So I was dehydrated, totally fearful. Then I stumbled, ripped my clothes, ripped my head, stumbled into the Rhine River, which isn't a big river at that point. It was probably 100 yards wide, flowing rather swiftly because it's just coming down out of the Alps, and floated, with the flow of the river, and I could touch the ground near the bottom in most places, but I could swim too, and kind of got myself up to the other bank and just kind of collapsed, kind of fitfully passed out. Got up the next morning, all stiff, cold as hell, and stumbled out on this little road and walked along. I didn't know. I just knew I had to go somewhere, rather than just sit there and die. And I was stumbling along this road, and this guy in a bike came roaring around the corner, and he stops and gets off the bike, and he's got a uniform on. It looks like a German uniform, a blue-gray uniform. And I said, oh God, after all this, didn't I get out? I thought maybe I'd cross back in or did some dumb thing. I was really almost delirious at that time. And I kind of stumbled to him, and I said, I got within about 20 feet. I don't know what I look like, but it would be nice to have that picture right now. But he was kind of apprehensive, because I was covered with blood and all sorts of things, mud and wet, miserable, mean looking probably. And I said, "Ich bin Amerikaner," and this guy said, "Je suis."
there were many prison camps in Germany, and the absolute best were the camps that housed American, British, and Commonwealth flyers. It was cold, rations were thin, it was dangerous, people were shot from time to time, it was no picnic, and a very hard life for the prisoners. But in many ways, it was the presidential suite of German imprisonment. The enlisted men and the armies who were prisoners from Britain, from the United States, and the Commonwealth countries, they lived harder than the flyers. Worse yet were the camps that held the French, the Dutch, the Yugoslav, the Danes, the Norwegians, those soldiers who had been taken in the early part of World War II. Worse yet were the camps for the Poles. And at the very bottom of the POW camps were the camps for the Soviet prisoners. Over 2.5 million Soviets became prisoners of the Germans, and most of them did not survive. In fact, the very first of the extermination camps at Auschwitz, at Dachau, the very first people to be killed were Soviet POWs before the Germans even got to extermination of the Jews. Worse yet than the Soviet POW camps were the concentration camps, where 6 million Jews, 2 million European communists, gypsies, homosexuals, German mentally retarded were all exterminated. These conditions were the ultimate of hell. And 168 Western flyers and several score special operations officers found themselves in exactly that level of hell. These were airmen and other officers who'd been taken not when they parachuted down and were caught by the local German police or civilians with guns. These were men who had, when they had landed, had managed to evade capture and linked up with the resistance, and were then captured by the Gestapo. They were subject to torture, to water torture, to savage beatings, and were all sent to Buchenwald. Here they lived for 5 months, just as the rest of the concentration camp prisoners did, daily facing execution, torture. All those special operations officers who'd been captured with the resistance were tortured and then murdered. Eventually, most of those Allied airmen who had ended up in Buchenwald were transferred to Stalag Luft camps as the Luftwaffe's paperwork finally caught up, and they delivered it to the Gestapo and took the prisoners over. These prisoners are probably the only ones to arrive in POW camp and be really impressed at the fine living conditions, the cleanliness, the luxury of the bunks, the fine clothing they had available, and the food that they just couldn't have imagined. But it's a good reminder that for most prisoners, the Nazis, conditions were just so horrible it's hard to imagine. The Allied airmen had it rough. It was never anything like Hogan's Heroes, but most of the other prisoners of the Nazis lived in absolute hell, and we must never forget this.